Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jeff Mann. I'm a Physical Threat Intelligence Analyst with Health ISAC, and I will be introducing today's speaker from Medcrypt. Today we'll be hearing from Naomi Schwartz, Senior Director for Cybersecurity Quality and Safety at Medcrypt, a medical device cybersecurity firm. She's a former pre-market reviewer and consumer safety officer in CDARH for 6.5 years, focused on software, interoperability, cybersecurity, and wireless coexistence for connected diabetes devices. Previously, she was a defense contractor for 15 years, developing radar systems and jammers for live field tests with operational DoD assets. On March 29, 2023, the FDA issued an updated final guidance on cybersecurity refuse to accept policy relating to acceptance of pre-market submissions. A significant change is the requirement for inclusion of cybersecurity-related documentation for medical devices with external wired and/or wireless communication interfaces, including cyber devices, as defined in the newly amended FD&C Act, Section 524B. In mapping the guidance to its new statutory authority, the FDA specifies that what is expected when a submission is provided to the agency for review. This webinar will focus on what this means for medical device manufacturers. The recording will be sent out to those present for this webinar and the regular recipient distribution, as well as posted to YouTube. There is a Q&A button on the top left of your screen and also below the presentation, but answers will be held until the end of the presentation. And with that, I'll pass it over to Naomi.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to focus today on 4 key areas. We're going to analyze the key requirements of Section 524B, which was enacted on March 29th, but passed last year, right at the end of the year. We're going to learn about the refuse to accept process at FDA for various submission types. We're going to learn how to avoid a refuse to accept or a refuse to file ruling from FDA. And we're going to talk briefly about the eSTAR submission template. So 524B in a nutshell, FDA is setting the bar for cybersecurity capabilities in medical devices. It's now required by law. What used to be guidance was a set of recommendations that people could try to dodge and make arguments against, are now required in your submissions for any pre-market notification or pre-market approval filing with FDA. You must include vulnerability monitoring and management, a total product life cycle, and a software bill of materials. There's also a 4th bullet in the bill, which says something to the effect of you must comply with such other requirements as the Secretary may require through regulation. And what that really means is, stay tuned. You know, FDA wants to have the ability to have some flexibility and to evolve their requirements with the evolving threat landscape. So that's really important because it means that you're going to need to watch for new regulation that may come out with not much warning. Now, obviously, FDA has some requirements about how they issue new regulation, but the reg was written and the statute is now written in a way that allows FDA to come up with new material on a more rapid cycle than they typically have pursued with cybersecurity. And that's very important because they have not been as agile to date as I think they would like to be and as I think is necessary. So, FDA is really trailblazing here. They're now asking you to submit to the Secretary a plan to monitor, identify, and address as appropriate in a reasonable time frame. Reasonable time frame is an interesting phrase. Post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits, including coordinated vulnerability disclosure and related procedures. So that means that when you submit in the pre-market, you already have to have a defined plan for post-market. You already have to have a defined coordinated vulnerability disclosure policy. It does not have to be public-facing, but FDA wants to see it to make sure that you have it. You're going to need to submit those things to FDA. What that really means, though, is that they can be asking you to have self-monitoring features in your devices. We know that FDA has issued a deficiency recently to a manufacturer who has submitted since March, and they said, basically, you need to explain to us, what you're going to do And specifically, they said you should implement features that allow for security compromises to be detected, recognized, logged, timed, and acted upon during normal use. Now, that language actually comes out of the 2014 pre-market guidance, but this is the first time I personally have ever seen them emphasize that aspect using Section 524B language in their deficiency. So what we've seen in the past is not a good indicator of what we're going to see in the future. FDA has already started shifting gears in their expectations and in what they're actually giving to manufacturers as feedback. So additionally, you now have to design, develop, and maintain processes and procedures to provide a reasonable assurance that your device and related systems are cyber secure when you submit them, and that you can make available post-market updates and patches to the device and related systems. That's to address reasonably justified regular cycle, known unacceptable vulnerabilities. Again, reasonably justified regular cycle. That is not a very specific timeline. And as soon as possible for out-of-cycle patches for critical vulnerabilities that could cause uncontrolled risk. Be very careful about how you interpret uncontrolled risk. Go back to the post-market guidance and review the specific language about what is and is not an uncontrolled risk. I have seen a number of medical device manufacturers misinterpret this and overclassify risks as uncontrolled when they are not, in fact, uncontrolled by FDA's own definitions. So that's really, really important. You don't want to be overly conservative with something like this, because you're going to put your entire team through a fire drill that is probably not necessary to the extent that you are pursuing it. We know, again, that FDA is issuing 524B language in deficiencies associated with the software and cybersecurity information submitted in a pre-market filing regarding how the software update mechanisms are secure. And we know that FDA has been asking a lot of companies to implement over-the-air updates or some other mechanism that provides close to real-time update cycle rather than SneakerNet, which could take weeks or months depending on the install base and the geographic spread. So it's going to be super, super important to have a plan for patching and to be able to operate against that plan. If you write a plan that looks completely ridiculous and is probably infeasible, you may get feedback from FDA about whether or not that plan looks ridiculous. I personally have given feedback about something like that while I was still at FDA, questioning whether or not a timeline was realistic given systems engineering processes. And typically what happens is you get a sort of uncomfortable chuckle back and people say, yeah, you're probably right. That's probably a little ambitious. So it should be realistic. FDA understands that you cannot fix things magically overnight as much as we wish we could. So in 3, FDA is really saying you need to provide FDA for review a software bill of materials. That's including your commercial, your open source, and off-the-shelf software components. If you wrote the software, you need to tell them about it. If you're incorporating, open source software, you need to tell them about it. They recognize if it's open source that you don't have full control over it. But we know that FDA is very, very attentive to software bill of materials because we have seen them using, again, Section 524B language in deficiencies. In this case, for software bill of materials, they're focused on whether or not it includes all baseline attributes. So they're pointing back to the NTIA minimum elements and saying, if you're missing one of those, that could be problematic. So they're saying, please be ensured your SBOM is consistent with an industry accepted format or best practice. And then they give, a list of options for that. But they're really saying, don't fudge this thing and don't wave your hands about what's in your software bill of materials. Be as complete as you can. They haven't specified how far down you need to go, so they don't talk about transitive dependencies. My personal opinion, you need to absolutely incorporate all of your software that you are putting in yourselves, and then within your own quality system, you should be maintaining, the layers of dependencies that you're aware of, because you need to monitor those for vulnerabilities, but you should submit to FDA what you include into your builds. So that's a first level software bill of materials. And then finally, this comply with other such requirements. This is a hold on to your hats, folks, kind of moment. This gives FDA that ability to adjust rapidly. So as the threat landscape evolves, the regs may do so as well. That's one of those things where, we're really going to have to pay attention to FDA issuing new information rapidly. So all of this is to say that FDA and other regulatory bodies are really asking for evidence that follows scientific methods and cybersecurity best practices. You want to give them information that is measurable. You want to produce plans that are repeatable. You want both the information you're providing and your approaches to things to be usable. Don't put together a plan that you can't implement because that's not usable for you. And when the FDA reviewer looks at it, it's probably not going to be usable for them as well. FDA is always your audience when you're putting together a pre-market submission, but it's not just FDA. It could be any other regulator as well. And FDA, I think, in cybersecurity is really trying to harmonize. So they're really focusing on making sure that their language and their requirements are not discordant with, IMDRF and what other regulators are looking for as well. So now we're going to transition to talking about the refuse to accept process for various submission types. This is really important to understand how the policy applies to a submission you may be preparing today. So FDA has this opportunity to refuse to accept a file. They receive a submission through the Document Control Center, and they're going to take a look at it and say, have you included this minimum set of elements that our guidance documents tell you you should include? For a 510K, you have a checklist that's actually in a guidance document. You can pull the checklist out. You can pull a checklist down off their website, and you can incorporate the entire checklist into your submission today. We'll talk more about that when we get to eSTAR, where it's really pertinent. But the checklist today is asking you if a device contains, external wired or wireless communication interfaces. So that could be a USB port, Ethernet, SD, CD, DVD, RGA, or Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RF, inductive cloud. If you have any kind of wired or wireless communication interfaces, you're going to need cybersecurity documentation. On the flip side, we've also heard that Dr. Schwartz at FDA is saying, basically, if you have software on board, you're going to need cybersecurity. But the checklist itself right now says, do you have these interfaces? If yes, please provide all applicable documentation identified by you, the submitter, per the guidance, or information that establishes that you have otherwise met statutory or regulatory criteria with the rationale for your cybersecurity. In a de novo, you actually have an interesting shift here. My reading of the most recent version of the de novo refuse to accept policy is that there are no specific requirements for cybersecurity in their current checklist. That does not mean that they won't refuse to accept. It just means that the checklist has not yet been updated to include the change in statutory authority. But you can use the same kind of refuse to accept template for de novos, where if you're missing relevant elements, which would include statutory requirements, you can get a refuse to accept for a de novo. For a PMA, it's slightly different. You actually have a refuse to file ruling with PMAs, and there are 5 major areas that FDA is focused on. Is your application complete per section 515C 1A through G of the Act? Now that's very specific. I'm not going to read off what those sections of the Act say, but you can certainly go do that. And we've provided links in the presentation to each of these relevant documents. If the PMA does not include the information under section 814.20 and lacks adequate justification for an omission relevant to that section, you can also receive a refuse to file. If you have a pending 510K for the same device without a determination from FDA that it falls into the scope of 814.1C, you will also receive a refuse to file. If your PMA contains a false statement of material fact, first of all, if it contains that, you're in deep trouble. Second, don't submit a PMA with a false statement of material fact. That is going to red flag pretty much anything you submit to FDA subsequently. And then finally, if your PMA is not accompanied by a statement of either certification or disclosure per 21 CFR 54, and that's your financial disclosure by clinical investigators. So those 5 pieces for PMA are critical. They're not going to refuse to file for cybersecurity per se, but they're going to be looking at it very, very rapidly as they go through the PMA review process. So the cybersecurity refuse to accept policy that was issued in March, which is the subject of today's webinar, was FDA's opportunity to announce how they're going to follow through on Section 524B of the Act. It's a warning to manufacturers to get you alert. They're going to start to refuse to accept submissions for lack of adequate cybersecurity content starting on October 1st. In the meantime, and the interim right now is the following 2 weeks, right? So it's really starting very soon. FDA is proceeding interactively. We've seen a lot of interactive review questions from FDA. FDA is also issuing substantial hold letters with numerous cybersecurity deficiencies. And we've seen a number of cases where, as I refer to it internally, they've thrown the kitchen sink at manufacturers because they see information about cybersecurity that is sparse, that is missing significant portions of what's recommended in the guidance. And they're basically going line by line through the 2014 guidance, not the draft 22, but the 2014 guidance, and citing anything that they can't find adequate information for, or anything where they find no information at all. So we're seeing a lot of this happening already, but the actual refuse to accept policy was intended to give time to adjust to those new 524B requirements. So you get an RTA or a refuse to file. So what? Refuse to accept or refuse to file decisions are going to be shared with the applicant, that's you, along with reasons for refusal, which identify the deficiencies in your application within 15 days of filing for a 510K or a de novo, or within 45 days for a PMA. FDA will begin substantive review of a submission only after they accept the file for review or for filing with a PMA. That's really important because if you're missing information, the FDA's clock stops and your clock keeps running. You're not even going to be accepted until you have enough information for them to start on. And that's not an assessment of adequacy. That is simply an assessment of, can I find the material? Is it present? The adequacy is going to get addressed during the substantive review process itself. So then let's talk a little bit about learning to avoid that refuse to accept filing, because that's really, really important. It affects your entire timeline. It affects how you're planning out your ability to go to market. So if you get a refuse to accept or a refuse to file, you may need to go back and change all of your documentation and add significant amounts of material to it in order to get through FDA's review process. You may also find that FDA identifies something that's going to require a design change. That could stretch your timeline out significantly. You should be prepared for potential questions from FDA that could require a design change. Hopefully, you won't receive those. But what we're really talking about here is achieving acceptance of your submission is key to your plans, right? You've got to get to market. You can't do that if you have no acceptance. That's your step one on the road to clearance or approval. You need to review the appropriate acceptance review information per FDA's guidance and checklists for the 510K, de novo, or PMA that you are submitting. Those checklists are available online. These can literally be part of your submission up front as a checklist that says, I have this, and here's what section or what appendix or what page you can find the information on. It's literally a checklist. I have reviewed 510Ks that include the 510K RTA checklist, and it is a fantastic roadmap. Somebody recently called it a treasure map in our conversations, and I actually really like that analogy, because it's, where do I go to find the buried treasure in this particular segment of your material? Cybersecurity is a treasure. It may be buried. Let's make it easy for FDA to find it. So you're going to ensure that you've given FDA that clear roadmap of where to find each key element for your 510K or de novo, with those official checklists if you choose to, or for a PMA, where you're focused on those 5 key criteria, but you also really want to make sure that you've covered cybersecurity overtly in the table of contents, for your executive summary for the PMA, and in an entire discrete section talking about the cybersecurity for your system in that PMA. So finally, this is the fun one. What is eStar? Where does this come in? Why is this being introduced in a discussion about refuse to accept? That's a fun one, because FDA sort of very quietly issued this additional information on their website for eStar that speaks to a new timeline. In June, they released final guidance about eStar, which is the electronic submission template and resource. Excuse me. Previously, eStar was a pilot program only, and it allowed manufacturers to opt into submitting electronically using that template for 510K and de novo submissions. FDA is now telling us through that webpage that starting on October 1st, FDA will require all 510K submissions to be filed using eStar. Does that mean that there's no RTA? That turns out to be an interesting question. So the eStar template doesn't even allow you as an applicant to submit to FDA until the template has been filled in completely. You're either going to assign a not applicable to a section in eStar, or you're going to assign a yes to it, in which case you must fill in all of the subsequent information in a particular section. The eStar will flag things like, do you have electronic interfaces? If you select yes in the eStar template, it will auto-propagate a new section for cybersecurity. Now that's today. I do not know if they're going to update what the eStar content actually shows starting October 1st. But theoretically, the eStar itself, that Adobe Acrobat template, is refusing to accept on behalf of FDA because you failed to identify something that you should have in your submission. That's even before it goes to FDA. Theoretically, that means that you shouldn't experience a situation where you're missing something. However, the eStar is not psychic, and it's not perfect, and it's not able to tell that, hey, you actually have an electronic interface and you said you don't. It does not do a check like that. Thankfully, there's no AI embedded in the backside of it either. So what we're really seeing with eStar is that the template performs some automatic verification of completeness of a submission as it is filled in. It's making sure that every single box has a selection of not applicable or yes, I've provided it. And it's saying, if you follow this template and you fill in every section that is outlined for you, you should have a complete submission. Therefore, FDA does not need a refuse to accept process for 510K using eStar, because the eStar achieves that for you. What really happens on the backside with eStar is that FDA will perform a technical screening process on the received eStar submissions, during which they're going to be looking for anything that you left out, which would lead to a deficiency and places the file on hold again before the actual FDA review clock would start. So here's an example. I have provided all of this material to document an in vitro diagnostic system. And as I was running through it, I failed to identify the fact that 2 components in my system are connected through an Ethernet cable, which means that they have external Ethernet ports, which are accessible to the user. There are electronic interfaces present in the system, and I failed to identify them, so eStar thinks I have none, and it did not auto-propagate the required cybersecurity documentation. That's how it is today in eStar. Again, that may change before October 1st. So the final eStar templates that are issued once this becomes live may be a little different than what you could download today. We'll be watching for that. But if you failed to include cybersecurity documentation because you failed to identify those Ethernet ports and the Ethernet cable connecting to components, you're going to get caught. FDA may catch it during their technical review, in which case you're automatically on hold before acceptance. They may also not catch it at that point, in which case they will reserve the right to issue interactive questions to you as soon as they do note that, or they could issue the deficiencies if there's material that's not present or inadequate in the submission. So you're going to have this template that's going to give you a really nice walkthrough of exactly how to complete a 510K filing. And if you've never done eStar during the pilot, I recommend that you start exploring it now and get your regulatory teams aware of it, because it is a little bit different for collaboration. You cannot put notes in there. You can't put comments. You cannot track changes. You're going to have to figure out how to take your normal documentation process and do all of the fine-tuning and refinement and collaboration in those documents, and then translate that content over to the eStar when it's finalized. But you should also be filling in the fields in the eStar as you progress, so that you make sure that you identify things like, oh, I need cybersecurity documentation. And as you fill out the cybersecurity portions of the eStar, it will be prompting you for sections of the material per the guidance. And that information will be something that you'll need to make sure you already have documents you can refer back to, that you can point to which exact document contains something, or which page it's on, or what table or section it's in, so that when FDA reviews it, they're using that eStar template as a roadmap themselves, and they're going to make sure that, yes, I see this, yes, I see this, oops, I don't see a software bill of materials. You said you had one. What I actually have is a list of off-the-shelf software. That is not a complete software bill of materials unless you don't have anything but OTS software built in. So that's really how eStar is going to affect this concept of refuse to accept. For a 510K, you won't have a refuse to accept. If you submit a de novo, which is your option, starting October 1st, it's only the 510K that's mandatory. You can still submit a de novo through eStar, and you will skip the RTA process on the formal side. You will get that technical screening process on the backside with your reviewer, and you will potentially be put on hold for significant missing information. So the too long didn't read. eStar and the cybersecurity refused to accept. For submissions starting on October 1st, you have to have all of your documentation prepared. There is a substantial amount of cybersecurity documentation that FDA is asking for. They're not only focused on pre-market, they're looking at your pre-market submission to tell them how you will manage on the post-market side. They will issue deficiencies stating that your post-market plans are inadequate, leveraging the 524B language. That's really, really important, because some people are interpreting what they're seeing from FDA to mean it's all focused on the pre-market and FDA is not going to be pushing for post-market action. It's not correct. They're really driving home that your pre-market plan should include how you will deal with the post-market. And if you're dealing with a post-market issue and you identify that your plans don't adequately handle a particular scenario, you need to update them and you need to document that as part of your quality system. You will have to use eStar for 510Ks from October 1st on. That is a requirement now. What it is going to lead to is some predictability, and it's supposed to simplify, and I think it really will simplify the process of putting together a submission package for a 510K, but it's also going to lead to consistency on the reviewer side. It's going to lead to consistency from one review of a device to the next review of it, from one reviewer within a branch to the next reviewer, from one branch or division or office to all of the others within the Office of Product Evaluation and Quality. So this is going to lead to some predictability for you as a manufacturer in how FDA is going to proceed through review. And it's going to lead to some consistency in what FDA is reviewing in terms of complexity, totality of content. If you have a really complex device, you're going to have more complex cybersecurity documentation. If you have a higher risk device, necessarily you're going to have more risk management discussion on cybersecurity. So all of those pieces need to come together in a holistic way, and the eStar is supposed to help guide you to do that in your presentation of all of your material, but with a focus on cybersecurity, which is really where FDA is saying, you know, we need to catch up. We're behind right now. We're not making sure that these devices are secure enough when they go to market, and we're having trouble keeping up with problems when they arise in the post-market. You should anticipate delays in your regulatory review and your clearance or approval for submissions if you don't have all of the material explicitly required under 524B, full stop. And if there are pieces recommended in the guidance which exceed what's in 524B, which there's a substantial amount of information in, I would treat those not so much as the recommendations that guidance is, but I would treat them as requirements. If there is an area that is not relevant to your design, your implementation, your risk management, you may provide a rationale, but you need to make sure that it is evidence-based, that it is really solid. And if you have a question about it, I strongly recommend that you ask FDA through a QSub, a question pre-submission, to make sure that you have the same interpretation of what FDA will look for as they're going to have when they look at it. We know that historically over the last 5 years, something on the order of 64 to 68% of original 510K submissions are receiving hold letters. So that's 2 out of 3 510Ks over the past 5 years on average have received deficiencies, not interactive review, but actually gone on hold. I think that number may expand over the next year or so as people adapt to what the cybersecurity requirements in a submission will entail. It is a significant disruption to your planning to go to market if you receive a hold letter. FDA obviously will stop their review clock when they issue a deficiency letter. So if you have a 90-day 510K review timeline and on day 50, they issue a deficiency letter, they stop and they're not working on it anymore. And now you have a fixed amount of time in which you can respond with a complete response addressing point by point everything in those deficiency letters. And that is going to disrupt all of the other activities that you have planned for your design team, your regulatory team, your quality team. Potentially, you could have clinical deficiencies. You might have new human factors studies required. You may discover that you should have done penetration testing on an end-to-end perspective, and you only penetration tested what you considered to be a risky element in your system. All of those things are going to add to your planning and to your timeline. And you want to try to preclude that happening so that when you say, I'm submitting on October 12th, 90 days from then, you can anticipate having clearance. Today, I would say plan for that not being 90 days out, but somewhere closer to 180 to 270 days out because of the extent to which we are seeing 510Ks go on hold. All of the material that you need to prepare for your pre-market submissions, no matter which flavor of submission you are producing, all of this is going to take significant preparation time. Even if you have submitted dozens of devices and you're just submitting a change to one, and you've already seen it and it's already been reviewed, and you know that those documents were good enough to get you cleared 8 months ago, 10 months ago, you should anticipate the possibility that FDA is going to have new questions about how that device is designed today, how that modification is affected by cybersecurity today that they didn't ask you about not that long ago. We know that they are doing this. We know that cleared devices that come in with modifications for review are receiving a laundry list of questions that they did not previously see from FDA. And many of those start off with, in accordance with Section 524B of the Act. So you know that they're using that statutory authority and they're throwing their weight around. It is not going to get easier over the subsequent months. FDA is really leveraging this opportunity to push manufacturers to do better before they go to market. We have a long list of cybersecurity guidance documents that you can leverage for preparing your submission. You should definitely be reviewing each of these. There's constantly new software guidance coming out. There are new draft guidances. All of those things affect how you put your submission together. But in particular, the final guidance for the content of premarket submissions from 2014 will reasonably soon be overruled. There will be a final guidance based on the 2022 draft. We don't know for sure if it will occur before October 1st. It may be that FDA is not ready to issue it then. I still think that they're probably trying really, really hard to get it out before October 1st because that's how they train their staff and that's how they will ensure that consistency of review. But look for it coming out really, really soon. I think you can also anticipate an update to that final guidance on post-market management. It'll come out as a draft. It'll be available for public review. If you find anything objectionable in it or something that you need clarification on, make sure to take advantage of that process. Public comment is intended for you to make sure that you can actually implement things that FDA is asking of you. So if you see something in a draft guidance that makes you wonder, or even in a final guidance where you're like, does it mean this or does it mean that? Ask FDA, take advantage of the docket system and put your questions out there because other people may have the same question, but they may not be asking it. They may not realize that they can or may not follow the process for how to do it. If you get that question out there, FDA can become aware that it's something that people are confused by or that they need to consider revising, and they can provide more clarity in subsequent versions of the guidance document. If you don't comment, they're going to assume that you understood it perfectly and that it is crystal clear, especially with the post-market guidance, which we haven't seen a draft revision for. When we see something, I think that there are going to be substantial changes to reflect that 524B language and to provide some more examples. And I think that that will be very, very important. So I am particularly looking forward to that. We've also seen some changes in the software guidance that is intended to reflect some of the language for cybersecurity and also reflect that harmonization that I mentioned earlier. Standards are really, really helpful for ensuring that your submissions are prepared appropriately. And to the extent that FDA can leverage standards in this space, they're going to be looking to. So I know that there's a new software guidance, and it actually takes away things like level of concern, which historically was an FDA-only thing. And they're leveraging, 62304 more. And they're basically saying you can declare conformity to 62304 as a standard and avoid some of the mishmash of documentation that you would otherwise put together that's very FDA specific. So maybe now you can put together submission packages that are nearly identical for FDA as the regulator versus getting a CE mark or going to market in East Asia or something like that. That's really important because it will take some of the burden off of you as a device manufacturer in trying to go to market in multiple locations around the world. And we know that FDA places a high value on that harmonization because they are leading some of the working group representation for IMDRF in cybersecurity, along with Health Canada. And we have seen significant activity from the FDA's Standards and Conformity Assessment Program in these international standards in cybersecurity, in AI and machine learning, in software, and in other spaces like electromagnetic compatibility. So it's going to be very, very important for you to go back and spend some quality time reviewing these guidance documents and make sure that you understand where FDA is coming from. I know that they've issued new information about off-the-shelf software recently as well, and that again is intended to reflect what is going on in 524B and what is going on in the way they think about software. So finally, wrapping up, the FDA changes to this cybersecurity refuse to accept policy are going to affect manufacturers. And when paired with the change in the eStar pilot program becoming actually a mandatory approach to filing 510Ks, you are going to see a dramatic shift in what your submissions look like, how substantial the information on cybersecurity is, and how much work it's going to take your teams to put together submissions. You may need to revamp some of your quality system to reflect those 524B requirements that are now part of the Act. And you're going to need to make sure that, for example, in your CAPA, you have some comments about what happens if the issue that you're trying to resolve and prevent reflects on cybersecurity. So make sure that you go back and do a holistic review of all of these parts. Even though FDA is not reviewing your quality system for a 510K, you need to make sure that your whole team understands how to integrate the cybersecurity approaches you're taking into your quality system. And we now have time for questions. And if you have anything following up after this program, you can email us at info@medcrypt.co.
Looks like you've got some questions in the queue here.
Excellent. Do you want to share some of them?
Here's an example of procedures to provide a reasonable assurance that the device is cyber secure.
So when FDA talks about procedures to provide a reasonable assurance that the device is cyber secure, they're talking about how you're going to test your system to verify that your requirements are fulfilled. You may require that only authorized users can access your system. You may require that you authenticate any software update packages before they're applied. Those kinds of procedures need to be verified if you have a set of requirements for them. How are you going to ensure that your software patch is authentic? You will have to validate all of those things. So as you perform a threat model, for example, you're going to take a look at the assets that are most important to be protected, and you're going to make sure that you have control measures to protect those assets. And in the process of that, you're going to have to validate that. So, penetration testing is one mechanism by which you would validate that. That is a procedure that will help you provide that reasonable assurance that the device is cyber secure. FDA, of course, has issued a laundry list in the guidance of mechanisms that you can use to provide that reasonable assurance. Some of them are not applicable to every device. So you may be asked about static testing, dynamic testing, fuzz testing. Those things are all pertinent to FDA's view of how to provide that reasonable assurance. That doesn't mean that every single one of them applies in every circumstance. It depends on your device design, its intended use environment, the types of users. All sorts of contextual information will help drive what kind of procedures you're going to use, but you need to validate that you have security today as it's designed to go to market. And then you're going to have to consider how that affects, in the post-market as well. And those may be slightly different considerations.
Thank you for that answer. Let's see. Are there any plans for FDA to require cybersecurity reviews, documentation to existing products post-market?
So that's a great question. Historically, once a device is cleared or approved for market, FDA does not come back and ask for additional information. This is a little bit different than the mechanisms under other regulatory frameworks. Once you're cleared to market, unless you have a recall-worthy scenario, you're not going to have additional questions from FDA. What you may see, and it's slightly different, is a situation like what happened during Urgent 11 or swine tooth, where FDA is using their internal database of all of the filings they've ever received, searching for software bills of material that include an indication that you may be vulnerable to a newly disclosed situation. Do you have a Bluetooth radio? Is Urgent 11 applicable to you? Because they're going to ask the highest risk devices. There's manufacturers, they're going to call them up. I actually had the joy of doing this, calling up 15 diabetes device manufacturers in a single day saying, call me back within half an hour, find out from your suppliers whether your Bluetooth chipset is vulnerable. Just because the researchers didn't list it doesn't mean it's not vulnerable. You know, if it means calling up Nordic, call Nordic and make sure that your chipset is not affected by swine tooth. You may see that kind of request post-market, but you won't see additional information needed request if you're already cleared. If you submit any change that FDA reviews, you may be affected by that, and they may ask you additional cybersecurity questions. But I don't think there's any authority for FDA to come back and say, hey, you know, we cleared this 3.5 years ago, but there was no cybersecurity information provided at that time. You need to do it now. They don't have that ability, and I don't think they want to do that either.
All right, thanks. And then we've got, for product development standpoint, when do you think vulnerability and cyber plans complete?
I'm not entirely sure that I understand how you intend for me to respond to that. But as you're developing your product, you should be considering the assets that you need to protect. You should be doing that threat modeling. That could be an iterative process across your entire life cycle. So you may start threat modeling early, and as you design and implement, you may modify your threat model and it may expand. That will include not only the assets, the potential threats, the risks associated with those threats, but also the controls. So you may start off with something small that starts to grow and grow. As you do that, your considerations of vulnerabilities and your planning to protect that particular device, and that's an end-to-end device, all of the assets that touch it, even if they're not regulated components, you need to consider those and you need to address them in your plans for post-market. In those cases, when is the vulnerability assessment complete? Well, theoretically, never, right? You're going to keep revising that and considering, are there new vulnerabilities that are being disclosed? So you're going to be looking at your software bill of materials on some kind of regular cycle to check against the National Vulnerability Database or other vulnerability databases available to you, checking against exploit databases, just to make sure that you're observing and that you're monitoring what's going on with your device, because what's not vulnerable today could be vulnerable in 2 hours. It could be vulnerable tomorrow. It may never be vulnerable, or it may be vulnerable, but you just haven't figured it out yet. And there isn't a disclosed vulnerability, but there's somebody out there who's probing these things, who's figuring out all the things they could, monkey around with, and then they don't activate it right away. So somebody's sitting on a bunch of vulnerabilities that they can exploit and hasn't chosen to activate it yet. In that perspective, I would be thinking more of a state actor, because they're the ones who are more strategic. The researchers are more tactical. They're like, oh, I found a way in. I'm going to tell you about it right now because I'm excited. Or maybe because they want, some attention. But in this case, we're really talking about thinking through what to do to validate for FDA that it's secure today, and how you would address that maintenance, that life cycle progression of, checking if it's vulnerable, figuring out how you would deal with it, having that post-market plan in play. Hopefully that addresses your question. If it doesn't, please provide some clarification about what you're asking for, and I'll be happy to try and answer it.
Any thoughts on the need to include a predetermined change control plan with the 501(k) and labeling pursuant to the draft guidance from April pertaining to the use of AI, ML in med device software?
The need to include. So FDA is not going to require you to include a PCCP. If you choose to include a predetermined change control plan, that could actually be completely irrelevant. Like, it has nothing to do with AI and machine learning. It could be a predetermined change control plan to ensure that my medical device that communicates with a mobile medical app is able to maintain compatibility with the mobile app's host operating system or host hardware or something like that. So a predetermined change control plan, first, if you are developing a system that includes AI and machine learning, you can use that draft guidance as a roadmap for including predetermined change control plan. That can be a 510K, it could be in a de novo, it could be in a PMA. We know that there has been a de novo granted where the decision summary itself actually tells you that it has a predetermined change control plan. So it is happening that people are submitting these things. If you have a PCCP in your submission, FDA will review it and it will be authorized as part of your clearance or approval. So if you do that, you could actually include cybersecurity elements to your PCCP. If we need to make a particular change to ensure continued security to our product, these are the ways we would validate it. If you have an appropriate set of changes, so that's the specific description of change type, and an appropriate validation methodology and appropriate acceptance criteria, you can get that PCCP authorized for software changes, for AI and machine learning algorithm changes, for, you know, mobile application compatibility or user interface type changes, or for cybersecurity maintenance. But it's not necessary. So there's no requirement that you should submit a PCCP, but I would personally look at that as an opportunity to plan ahead and think about how I would go about doing a PCCP, give FDA a flow diagram of, you know, the thought process, the types of changes, the types of validation, you know, what kinds of acceptance criteria are appropriate. And you know, if it's relevant to your device design, get it authorized, because that makes things a lot easier. There's a corollary to that, which is if your device is cleared or approved with a PCCP, that may be used as a predicate if it's a 510K, but any modifications made pursuant to that PCCP, those cannot be used as predicates. So it's only the originally cleared device and its PCCP that could be a predicate. That's a little nuance in how predetermined change control plan is currently considered by FDA, but the appropriations bill included not only Section 524B, which focuses on that cybersecurity material, but on a Section 515C, which includes that FDA can review and should review PCCP if it's provided in a submission. So that gives them the authority, rather than sort of this flexible thinking of, you know, maybe they're allowed to do it, but maybe they don't have authority. Now they really have authority to review a PCCP in the context of your submission and to authorize it for you.
It's another one. We're starting to see other countries like Japan push for compliance to the requirements 81001-5-1. As MDMs seek to ensure their policies and procedures drive the correct activities and deliverables, would you consider this standard as the one to align to? What other standards should be considered?
Sure. So when you're thinking about standards that you can leverage, first of all, if you're using standards for other regulators, recognize that whether FDA has acknowledged those standards through an official recognition or not, you can leverage those standards. If FDA has officially recognized a standard, that means that they've given it strong consideration. If they give it full recognition, they don't find anything in it so overtly objectionable that they're going to tell you, or they'll give a partial recognition and tell you exactly which clauses they find problematic, you can leverage a standard whether or not FDA recognizes it. If FDA doesn't recognize it, their staff may not be trained to actually understand what's in it. But if it is recognized, and I think 81001-5-1 is, you absolutely can leverage it. There are other standards that are pertinent, UL 2900, the IEEE P2621 series, which is specific to diabetes products, could be generalized. You could use it for other devices because it's a good framework, whether or not you're a diabetes connected device. I believe the .2 is the only part that's recognized there, but the part 3 is it's a set of recommended practices anyway. So that there are 3 parts to that. FDA recognized that last year. I was actually one of the liaisons on it. So I have particular feelings about that standard. There are a number of standards in the 11073 series from IEEE that are also relevant. Those are protocol agnostic standards that talk about how to get devices in the home use or point of care to be interoperable, but it includes a significant discussion on cybersecurity. And the really great thing is that the Bluetooth SIG is implementing their options, their protocols and everything to follow 11073 specifically for Bluetooth low energy. So if you look at 11073 and you say, wow, that'd be a really great fit for me for my insulin pump or, you know, my blood pressure monitor or something like that, you can then take that standard, and there are a number of them recognized by FDA, and leverage them for how you handle the interoperability aspect or the cybersecurity or both. You can pick and choose what parts you want to use it for, and you can leverage those. So if there is a standard that FDA recognizes and you're using it, absolutely cite it, put it forefront that you're using that and leveraging it and how you're using it. But you don't have to use standards. I'll give an example of why you don't have to use them, but probably why you should use them in certain cases. For electromagnetic compatibility, there are 2 primary standards. IEC 60601-1-2, which is directly cited in FDA guidance. That's not a very typical thing, by the way. FDA largely tries to not cite specific standards. In this case, it is so thoroughly used and such an obvious way to do the testing that, you know, they specifically cite it in their guidance on EMC. Or for an IVD system, if it's not considered MEE under 60601, it would be following 61326-2-6. Of those 2 standards, you do not have to use either one for your device. But if you don't, you have to give them a very detailed methodology for your testing that would probably inevitably end up looking exactly like the standard anyway. So that would be an example where just follow the standard, because, you know, labs know how to do that, and you can document it really easily because it's already written for you. In cybersecurity, there is a little bit less of that. The words "it depends" show up in a lot of FDA vernacular. The reason is because in cybersecurity, you can't say, do it this way and you'll get repeatable results. It depends on your device design. It depends on your implementation. It depends on the risks associated with your indications for use, your intended use population, the intended use environment, the intended users themselves. So it's a little bit harder to say, oh, there's a standard that's going to give you the solution for how to do your procedures and processes, what tests to perform. But some of those standards are really moving toward a repeatable set of processes and procedures that you can leverage. Take a look at the test planning under 2621 as an example. They're really trying to make this something that a test lab could follow and produce a report to, and provide really clear indications of what was done, why it's appropriate, and why FDA should go, yay, cool, you did the right thing. None of these are going to be perfect, but they're really starting to converge on standards that you can leverage in this way, where 10 years ago, standards in cybersecurity for the medical device space were sort of theoretical, not you know, pie in the sky. We're thinking about them. We're starting to draft stuff, but they weren't solid enough that you could reasonably point to one and say, I can use this, and you'll know what I'm doing, and it will make sense, and you'll agree with my approach.
Thank you for that answer. I was going to try and squeeze one more in here, but I think we're kind of up at the hour. Do you want to try and get one more in?
We can do one more.
Okay, so hopefully I'm asking this right. Can I add to eStar the RTA general table for 501k and RTA cybersecurity table additionally?
So the eStar template is very, very specific, and it is not something where you can add new material to it. You can add content within the eStar fields, or you can just add that content to the documents that you attach to the eStar. But the eStar is asking you very specific questions. It has checkboxes, yes, no. If you check a yes, or not applicable, if you check a yes, it may propagate an additional set of fields. It is not asking you to dump, graphical tables into it. It's asking you, what document is this material in? Refer back to it, or give me a single paragraph that gives me information about something, and then point me to a document where you expand upon a particular topic. Tell me what page number it might be on, or what section number. But you cannot drop a checklist table into it. It should replace the checklist, though. You should not need to use a 510K checklist, the refuse to accept checklist, if you're using eStar. And if you propagate your information correctly and identify things like, I have software and I have electronic interfaces, it should generate the entire cybersecurity section for you in a step-by-step way, where you know that I need to talk about software bill of materials, and I need to talk about my plans to ensure that it's cyber secure, and my post-market plans, and my patch management, and all of those aspects of the total product lifecycle that give you a secure product.
Thank you so much for that. And so that does bring us to the end of the hour. So unfortunately, we're going to have to end here. But I'd like to once again thank our speaker, Naomi, for her insight, and our listeners for taking the time to attend this webinar. So thanks, everybody. And be sure to email if you have any questions.
Thank you.